The year was 1847, and the Blackwood plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of South Carolina's most fertile land. Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, casting eerie shadows across the cotton fields where hundreds of enslaved souls toiled under the merciless sun. At the heart of this empire of suffering stood Jeremiah Blackwood, a man whose cruelty was legendary even among his fellow plantation owners. Jeremiah had built his fortune on the backs of others, but his greatest obsession was not wealth, it was power. The power to control every aspect of life and death on his land. His mansion, with its towering white columns and wraparound porches, overlooked the slave quarters like a watchtower, a constant reminder of his dominion. But Jeremiah harbored a secret shame that gnawed at his pride daily. His only child, Evangeline, had been born blind. The doctors in Charleston had declared her condition permanent, a cruel twist of fate that Jeremiah saw as a personal affront to his family's superiority. While other plantation owners' daughters attended balls and married into wealthy families, Evangeline remained hidden away in the mansion's upper floors. The enslaved people whispered about the girl they rarely saw, speaking of her ethereal beauty and the way she seemed to sense things others could not. They called her the ghost child, for she moved through the house like a spectre, her pale hands trailing along the walls, her unseeing eyes somehow penetrating the darkness that surrounded her. What they didn't know was that Jeremiah's twisted mind was already formulating a plan that would transform his daughter's disability into what he believed would be his greatest triumph. A plan so horrific that it would ultimately bring about the destruction of everything he had built. Jeremiah's obsession began with a conversation he overheard between two of his most trusted enslaved workers, Moses and Samuel. They spoke in hushed tones about how blind people often developed extraordinary abilities in their other senses. Hearing that could detect the slightest sound, touch so sensitive it could read the emotions of others, and an almost supernatural intuition about their surroundings. That night, as Jeremiah sat in his study surrounded by ledgers documenting his human property, a grotesque idea began to take shape. If blindness could enhance other senses, what would happen if he could breed children who inherited both Evangeline's heightened abilities and the physical strength of his strongest field hands? The resulting offspring could become the perfect workers, strong enough for the hardest labor, yet sensitive enough to detect problems before they arose. The plan that formed in his diseased mind was as calculated as it was monstrous. He would select 11 of his most physically impressive enslaved men, each possessing different strengths and capabilities. Through forced breeding with Evangeline, he would create a new generation of workers who would be entirely dependent on him, bound by blood and circumstance to serve the Blackwood legacy forever. Jeremiah spent weeks studying his human property like livestock, examining their builds, their intelligence, their health records. He made detailed notes about each potential father, creating what he called his breeding schedule. Moses, with his incredible strength and gentle nature. Samuel, known for his sharp mind and problem-solving abilities. Thomas, whose endurance in the fields was legendary. Each man represented a different trait Jeremiah hoped to capture in his grandchildren. The most chilling aspect of his plan was how methodically he approached it, treating his own daughter as nothing more than a breeding vessel for his twisted experiment. Evangeline Blackwood had lived her 19 years in a world of shadows and whispers. Her blindness had made her father's prisoner long before his horrific plan took shape. She spent her days in the mansion's upper rooms, attended by a rotating cast of enslaved women who had been instructed to keep her isolated from the outside world. Despite her confinement, Evangeline possessed an intelligence that her father had consistently underestimated. Her other senses had indeed sharpened beyond normal human capacity. She could identify people by their footsteps, detect lies in the tremor of a voice, and sense emotions through the subtle changes in breathing patterns and body heat. The enslaved women who cared for her, particularly an older woman named Mama Ruth, had become her only connection to the reality of plantation life. Through their whispered conversations, Evangeline had learned about the brutality that existed beyond her silk-draped prison. She knew about the whippings, the family separations, the countless cruelties that her father inflicted daily. What Evangeline didn't know was that her father had been watching her more closely than ever, studying her movements and abilities with the cold calculation of a scientist observing a specimen. He had noticed how she could navigate the mansion's complex layout without assistance, how she seemed to know when storms were approaching hours before they arrived, and how the enslaved women spoke to her with a reverence that bordered on fear. In Jeremiah's twisted mind, these abilities confirmed his theory. His daughter was not disabled, she was evolved, and soon he would put his plan into motion to create an entire generation of such evolved beings, all under his complete control. The mansion's walls seemed to close in around Evangeline as an inexplicable sense of dread began to settle over her daily routine. The cotton harvest of 1847 provided Jeremiah with the perfect cover for his initial selections. As was customary, he conducted his annual review of the enslaved workforce, ostensibly to determine work assignments for the coming year. But this time, his evaluation criteria were far more sinister. Moses was the first to be chosen. At 25, he stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with muscles carved from years of loading cotton bales and clearing fields. More importantly, Moses possessed a gentleness that made him beloved among the enslaved community. Children flocked to him during the brief evening hours of rest, and he had never raised his voice in anger, even under the most brutal treatment. Samuel came next, a man of 30 whose intelligence had made him invaluable as an overseer of the other workers. He could calculate crop yields in his head, predict weather patterns, and organize work crews with an efficiency that had increased plantation productivity by 20%. Jeremiah had often wondered what Samuel might have accomplished if born free. Thomas, barely 21, represented pure physical endurance. He could work 18-hour days in the blazing sun without showing fatigue, and his hands had never trembled even during the most grueling tasks. His stamina was legendary among both enslaved and free workers alike. One by one, Jeremiah selected his 11 subjects, each chosen for specific traits he hoped to see combined with Evangeline's enhanced sensory abilities. There was David, whose night vision was so acute he could navigate the plantation in complete darkness. Marcus, whose hearing was so sensitive he could detect conversations from impossible distances. Benjamin, whose sense of touch was so refined he could identify different types of soil blindfolded. Each selection was documented in Jeremiah's private ledger with clinical precision, as if he were breeding horses rather than planning to destroy human lives. On a suffocating August evening, Jeremiah finally revealed his plan to Evangeline. She sat in her usual chair by the window, her fingers tracing patterns on the silk curtains as she listened to the sounds of the plantation settling into night. The approach of her father's footsteps, heavier than usual, with a deliberate cadence that spoke of momentous decision, made her stomach clench with inexplicable dread. "Evangeline," Jeremiah began, his voice carrying the same tone he used when discussing business matters with his overseers, "you are 19 years old. It's time you contributed to the family legacy in a meaningful way." What followed was a monologue so horrific that Evangeline initially believed she was experiencing some sort of nightmare. Her father explained his breeding program with the detached efficiency of a livestock farmer, describing how her blindness was actually a gift that would be passed down to create superior workers. He spoke of genetic advantages, of enhanced bloodlines, of building an empire that would last for generations. Evangeline's enhanced senses picked up every detail of her father's emotional state as he spoke. His heart rate was elevated with excitement, not nervousness. His breathing was steady and controlled. There was no shame, no hesitation, no recognition of the monstrosity he was proposing. To him, this was simply good business. "You will bear children with 11 different men," he concluded matter-of-factly. "Each child will inherit your abilities combined with their father's strengths. They will be raised here, educated here, and will work these lands with capabilities no ordinary worker could match." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of night insects and Evangeline's increasingly rapid breathing. Her world, already constrained by darkness, had just become a prison of unimaginable horror. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "And if I refuse?" Jeremiah's answer chilled her to the bone. Refusal is not an option. The enslaved community had developed an intricate network of communication that operated beneath the plantation's official hierarchy. Information traveled through work songs, coded conversations, and subtle gestures that overseers never noticed. Within days of Jeremiah's selections, every person in the quarters knew something terrible was being planned. Moses was the first to approach the others. His gentle nature masked a fierce intelligence and an unbreakable moral code. He gathered the selected men in the old tobacco barn after midnight, speaking in whispers that barely disturbed the humid air. "We all know what he's planning," Moses said, his massive frame silhouetted against the moonlight filtering through broken boards. "That girl ain't done nothing to deserve what he wants to do to her, and we ain't gonna be part of it." Samuel nodded grimly. His years of managing other workers had taught him the importance of unity in the face of impossible odds. "The question is what we can do about it. Running means dogs and death. Fighting means the same." But it was Thomas, the youngest of the group, who voiced what they all knew. "Maybe dying's better than living with what he wants us to do." The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, as 11 men grappled with an impossible choice. They could comply and become willing participants in an act of unthinkable cruelty, or they could resist and face certain death, not just for themselves, but likely for their families and friends as well. Marcus, whose acute hearing had detected approaching footsteps long before the others noticed, signaled for silence. They dispersed like shadows, each man carrying the weight of a decision that would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of an innocent young woman trapped in her father's monstrous vision. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, but in a system designed to crush hope, even the strongest seeds struggled to take root. Mama Ruth had served the Blackwood family for over 30 years, arriving as a young woman and aging into the role of head house servant through a combination of intelligence, discretion, and an uncanny ability to anticipate the family's needs. She had raised Evangeline from birth, becoming more of a mother to the girl than Jeremiah's deceased wife had ever been. The morning after Jeremiah's announcement, Mama Ruth found Evangeline sitting motionless by her window, tears streaming down her face in silent rivers. The older woman's heart broke as she witnessed the destruction of the innocent spirit she had helped nurture for 19 years. "Child," Mama Ruth whispered, settling her weathered hands on Evangeline's shoulders. "I heard what he told you. I heard every word through these thin walls." Evangeline turned toward the familiar voice, her unseeing eyes searching for comfort in the darkness that surrounded her. "How can he do this, Mama Ruth? How can a father destroy his own daughter?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Mama Ruth had witnessed countless horrors during her decades on the plantation, but this surpassed them all in its calculated cruelty. She had seen families torn apart, children sold away from their mothers, men worked to death in the fields. But this was different. This was evil disguised as progress. "Listen to me carefully," Mama Ruth said, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. "There are things happening in the quarters. Good men are talking about what's right and what's wrong. Your daddy may think he owns everything and everyone, but he don't own souls, and souls got a way of fighting back." She paused, glancing toward the door to ensure they weren't being overheard. "There's also things about this plantation that your daddy don't know. Old things. Things that been here since before his family ever set foot on this land." Evangeline's enhanced senses detected a change in Mama Ruth's emotional state, a mixture of fear and something else, something that felt almost like anticipation. What Jeremiah Blackwood didn't know about his plantation could have filled volumes. The land he had inherited from his father, who had claimed it through violence and legal manipulation, held secrets that predated European settlement by centuries. The enslaved community, particularly those who had arrived directly from Africa, recognized the signs that the white family had consistently ignored. Mama Ruth led Evangeline through the mansion's back corridors late one night, moving with a stealth that belied her age. They descended to the cellar, then through a hidden passage that Evangeline had never known existed. The air grew cooler and carried scents that seemed to whisper of ancient rituals and forgotten powers. "This land was sacred long before your family came here," Mama Ruth explained as they walked. "The people who lived here first, they knew things, they left things, and some of us who came later, we brought our own knowledge from across the water." They emerged into a natural cave system that extended far beneath the plantation grounds. The walls were covered with symbols, some clearly Native American, others that appeared to be African in origin, and still others that seemed to represent a fusion of traditions born from shared suffering and resistance. Every person who ever died on this land, every soul that was broken here, they left something behind, Mama Ruth continued. "Your daddy thinks he controls everything, but there are forces here that have been waiting for the right moment to balance the scales." Evangeline's heightened senses were overwhelmed by the cave's atmosphere. She could feel the weight of history pressing down around them, hear whispers that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. Her fingers traced symbols on the walls that felt warm to the touch, as if they were alive with some form of energy. "What does this have to do with what my father is planning?" Evangeline asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Mama Ruth's response sent chills through the humid air. "Child, some things in this world can't be controlled, no matter how much power a man thinks he has, and what your daddy's planning to do, it's gonna wake up things that been sleeping for a long, long time." The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. 3 days after his announcement to Evangeline, Jeremiah summoned Moses to the main house. The enslaved man stood in the parlor, his massive frame dwarfing the delicate furniture, while Jeremiah outlined his expectations with the casual tone of someone discussing crop rotation. "You will be the first," Jeremiah stated, consulting his leather-bound ledger. "Your physical attributes, combined with my daughter's enhanced senses, should produce offspring of exceptional capability. You will report to her chambers tonight." Moses stood silent for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on a point just over Jeremiah's shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the ornate room. "No, sir, I won't be doing that." The words hung in the air like the calm before a hurricane. Jeremiah's face slowly transformed from surprise to disbelief, to a rage so intense that his hands began to tremble. In 30 years of owning human beings, no one had ever directly refused his orders. "What did you say?" Jeremiah's voice was barely controlled, each word dripping with the promise of violence. Moses straightened to his full height, meeting Jeremiah's gaze directly for the first time in his life. I said, "No, sir, I won't hurt that girl. I won't be part of what you're planning. You can kill me if you want, but I won't do it." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Jeremiah's chair scraping against the wooden floor as he stood. His hand moved instinctively to the pistol he always carried, but something in Moses's demeanor gave him pause. There was no fear in the enslaved man's eyes, only a calm resolution that spoke of a decision already made and accepted. "You seem to have forgotten your place," Jeremiah said, his voice now deadly quiet. "Perhaps a reminder is in order." But as he reached for his weapon, a sound from upstairs made both men freeze, a low, mournful wailing that seemed to come from the very walls of the mansion itself. The sound that echoed through the Blackwood mansion that night was unlike anything the living had ever heard. It began as a whisper, barely perceptible above the usual settling noises of the old house, but gradually grew into a chorus of voices that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of the building. Evangeline, alone in her chambers, felt the vibrations through her bare feet on the wooden floor. Her enhanced senses, already strained by days of terror and anticipation, picked up harmonics and frequencies that others missed. The voices were singing, not in English, but in languages that predated the plantation by centuries. African chants blended with Native American prayers, creating a symphony of resistance that had been building for generations. In the quarters, the enslaved community recognized the signs immediately. Old Sarah, who claimed to remember her grandmother's stories from across the ocean, began rocking back and forth on her cabin's front step, her voice joining the ethereal chorus. Others followed, their voices adding to a spiritual uprising that had been dormant for decades. Jeremiah, still confronting Moses in the parlor, felt the house begin to vibrate around them. Dust fell from the ceiling beams, and the crystal glasses in his liquor cabinet began to chime against each other in an otherworldly percussion. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and both men could see their breath in the suddenly frigid air. "What is this?" Jeremiah demanded, his earlier confidence evaporating as the supernatural forces he had never acknowledged began to manifest around him. Moses, his face illuminated by an inner peace that transcended his circumstances, smiled for the first time in years. "That's the sound of every soul you ever broke, Mr. Blackwood. They've been waiting for this moment, and now they're awake." The mansion shuddered as if struck by an earthquake, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of breaking chains echoed through the night air, though every physical restraint on the plantation remained intact. By dawn, the supernatural awakening had spread beyond the Blackwood plantation. Neighboring estates reported similar phenomena: unexplained sounds, sudden temperature drops, and an overwhelming sense of presence that left even the most hardened overseers shaken. Word spread through the network of enslaved communities like wildfire, carrying with it a message that had been centuries in the making. The time of reckoning had arrived. Jeremiah, who had spent the night barricaded in his study with a loaded rifle, emerged to find his carefully ordered world in chaos. Several of his overseers had fled during the night, claiming they could no longer bear the haunted atmosphere of the plantation. The enslaved workers, while still present, moved with a new sense of purpose that he found deeply unsettling. Most disturbing of all was the change in Evangeline. When he climbed the stairs to check on his daughter, he found her standing in the center of her room, no longer the fragile, dependent creature he had controlled for 19 years. Her unseeing eyes seemed to track his movements with impossible accuracy, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made him step backward involuntarily. "The voices told me everything, Father," she said, her words cutting through the morning air like a blade. "They told me about the others who came before, about the children who were born from violence and died from neglect. They told me about the mothers who threw themselves into the river rather than watch their babies grow up in chains." Jeremiah's hand moved to his pistol, but found himself unable to draw it. Some force seemed to have frozen his muscles, leaving him helpless before his own daughter. "They also told me about what happens to men who try to play God with human lives," Evangeline continued, moving toward him with a grace that defied her blindness. "The land remembers, Father. Every drop of blood, every tear, every scream. And now it's time to pay the debt." Outside, the sound of approaching horses could be heard, but these were not the horses of fleeing overseers. These carried riders whose purpose was far more ominous. The riders who approached the Blackwood plantation that morning were not entirely human. They appeared to be Confederate soldiers at first glance, but their uniforms bore stains that looked suspiciously like blood, and their horses' hooves made no sound on the hard-packed earth. Leading them was a figure that Jeremiah recognized with growing horror. His own father, dead these 15 years, but now returned with eyes that burned like coals in a face pale as cemetery marble. "Hello, son," the specter said, dismounting with movements that seemed to flow like smoke. "I've come to collect what's owed." The supernatural army that materialized around the plantation consisted of every person who had died under Blackwood ownership, enslaved workers who had perished from overwork, children who had succumbed to disease and neglect, women who had died in childbirth after being bred like livestock. They stood in silent ranks, their presence a testament to generations of cruelty that had finally reached its breaking point. Jeremiah, his sanity fracturing under the weight of impossible reality, stumbled backward into his mansion. But the house itself seemed to have turned against him. Doors slammed shut on their own, trapping him in corridors that stretched longer than they should have. The portraits of his ancestors watched him with accusing eyes, and their painted mouths moved to whisper condemnations that echoed through the halls. In the quarters, the living enslaved community watched in awe as their departed loved ones materialized among the spectral army. Families were reunited across the veil of death, if only for this moment of cosmic justice. Moses felt his father's hand on his shoulder. The man who had died when Moses was 12, worked to death in the cotton fields. Samuel embraced the ghostly form of his mother, sold away when he was 8 and never seen again. But it was Evangeline who commanded the supernatural forces gathering around the plantation. Her blindness, which her father had seen as a weakness to be exploited, had actually made her sensitive to the spiritual realm that existed parallel to the physical world. She had become a conduit for the collective rage of the oppressed, a focal point for justice that had been denied for far too long. As the sun set on what would be the last day of the Blackwood plantation, Evangeline stood in the mansion's grand foyer, surrounded by the spirits of the dead and the living enslaved community who had finally found their courage. Her father cowered in the corner, his mind shattered by the revelation that his crimes had consequences beyond the physical world. The supernatural forces that had awakened did not seek simple revenge. Instead, they demanded a justice that would ripple through time itself. Jeremiah Blackwood would live, but he would live with the knowledge of every life he had destroyed, feeling their pain as his own for whatever years remained to him. His plantation would be transformed into something entirely different, a sanctuary where the descendants of the enslaved would prosper, protected by the very spirits he had tried to exploit. But as the immediate crisis resolved, Evangeline sensed something else stirring in the spiritual realm. Her father's plan, monstrous as it was, had been part of a larger pattern that extended far beyond South Carolina. Other plantations, other families, other experiments in human breeding and exploitation were still operating throughout the South. The awakening at Blackwood had been just the beginning. The 11 men who had been selected for Jeremiah's breeding program stood with Evangeline as the supernatural army began to fade back into the spirit realm. But they were no longer the same men who had been chosen as victims. The spiritual awakening had changed them, enhanced them in ways that Jeremiah's crude genetic theories could never have achieved. They had become something new, guardians of a power that would spread throughout the enslaved communities of the South. As the last of the spirits disappeared into the gathering darkness, Evangeline turned her unseeing eyes toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, other plantations continued their brutal operations. Other families suffered under similar horrors. The work was far from over. The Blackwood plantation had fallen, but the true reckoning was just beginning. And in the distance, carried on the night wind, came the sound of other voices awakening, voices that had been silent for too long, now ready to join the growing chorus of supernatural justice that would soon sweep across the entire South. What had been born from Jeremiah Blackwood's evil would indeed devastate South Carolina, but not in the way he had intended. The devastation would be the complete destruction of the system he had tried to perfect, replaced by something far more powerful than he had ever imagined possible. The blind daughter he had sought to exploit had become the catalyst for a revolution that would transcend the boundaries between life and death, between the physical and spiritual worlds. And her story was far from over.